I still remember the day the courtroom went silent. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of morning where the light comes through those tall windows at just the wrong angle, making everything look a little bit more like a crime scene than it probably is. My father sat across from me, hands folded on the wooden table, and his lawyer, a woman named Margaret with gray streaks in her hair and the kind of tired eyes that come from fighting other people's battles for 30 years, she leaned over and whispered something that made his jaw tighten. "If the court sides with her," Margaret said, and I could hear the weight of those words even from where I was sitting, "you could lose everything. And more importantly, she could take control of his future." The courtroom was packed that day. Not with celebrities or famous people, but with regular folks who had read the headlines, heard the story on local news, and decided that this particular family drama deserved their time on a Tuesday morning. Behind me, I could feel their eyes. In front of me, I could see my brother Caleb sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his lap with that peculiar calm that has always defined him, even when everything around him was falling apart. Caleb was wearing a blue button-down shirt, the one he picked out himself because it matched his favorite coffee mug, and he looked so young in that moment, even though he was 24 years old. The judge, a man named Richard Morrison who had been hearing cases in Davenport District Court for the better part of 2 decades, he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him. And that's when I realized that everything my family had fought for over the last 11 years was about to come down to a single decision made by a stranger in a black robe. But before we go any further, before I take you back to where this all started, I need to tell you something. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. It started 11 years before that Tuesday in March. It started on a night when the sky was the color of old bruises, and my mother, her name was Elaine, she just walked out of our house and never looked back. I was 16 years old and Caleb was 13, and our father was the kind of man who worked double shifts at Genesis Medical Center in Davenport because that's what you did when your family needed you. That's what responsibility meant to him. That's what love looked like in his hands, steady, consistent, unglamorous. Elaine had always been different from Dad. Where he was quiet, she was loud. Where he was content with simple things, she wanted everything, and I mean everything. She wanted to be recognized. She wanted to matter in the way that celebrities matter, in the way that people on television matter. She used to stand in front of the mirror for hours, practicing expressions, rehearsing conversations she thought she might have someday with important people. I remember thinking even back then that she was performing her own life rather than actually living it. But that night, when the sky was bruised and the wind was rattling the windows of our house, something shifted. There was a fight, the kind of fight that doesn't make sense until years later, when you understand that sometimes people are fighting about something that has nothing to do with what they're actually saying. My mother was angry that Dad had chosen to work instead of going to some networking event downtown. My father was frustrated that she didn't understand that bills needed to be paid, that Caleb had school fees, that life required the kind of work that doesn't get applause. Caleb was in his room, and I was pretending to do homework in mine, but I could hear every word traveling through the walls of that modest 2-bedroom house we rented in a neighborhood where neighbors still waved to each other. When the fight ended, there was a silence that felt heavier than the shouting had been. And then the front door opened, and my mother walked out with a single suitcase, the one she used for her weekend trips to visit her sister in Des Moines. We all thought she would come back. We thought maybe she needed an hour or two to cool down, maybe she'd go to a hotel for the night, maybe by morning everything would feel different. But morning came, and then another morning came, and then a whole year of mornings came, and Elaine never came back. What followed was the kind of devastation that doesn't announce itself with tragedy. It was quiet. It was the sound of my father working even longer hours. It was the sight of Caleb asking me repeatedly for the first 3 months if Mommy was coming home, and me having to lie and say I didn't know, when what I really meant was yes, eventually, she has to, because mothers don't just leave their children. But Elaine did. She left and she stayed gone, and she stayed gone so thoroughly that we eventually stopped waiting. My father, he became something different after that. He became harder in some ways, softer in others. He became a man who would do anything to make sure that his children, because that's how he thought of us, as his alone now, his responsibility, his light, he would do anything to make sure we never felt that abandonment again. He would spend entire weekends helping Caleb with homework. He would remember every single doctor's appointment, every school meeting, every moment that mattered. And Caleb, brilliant Caleb with his autism spectrum diagnosis and his extraordinary mind, he bloomed under that attention. He had always been different from other kids. His teachers used to call him gifted but challenged, which I always thought was the worst way to describe a human being, as if his beautiful, unique brain was a problem to be solved rather than a treasure to be understood. But our father understood it. He understood Caleb in the way that only a parent can, in the way that comes from paying attention to someone for every single day of their life, learning their rhythms, their triggers, their particular genius. Caleb had always been obsessed with patterns and code. When he was 8 years old, he asked our father what programming was, and Dad, despite not knowing much about computers himself, he found an old laptop and set Caleb up with tutorials. Caleb taught himself to code. By age 13, he was writing complex applications. By 17, he had created something remarkable. The app was called ConnectFlow, and it was designed specifically for people on the autism spectrum to manage daily tasks, social interactions, and sensory challenges. It wasn't a generic planner or a productivity tool. It was Caleb's own answer to his own struggles, encoded into something that other people could use. He released it into the world without expecting much of anything. But the world had other plans. ConnectFlow went viral because it actually worked. Because Caleb had built something from genuine understanding rather than from a corporate desire to capture market share. People with autism, they found it and they told their friends, and their friends told their friends, and suddenly there were thousands of people using it. App designed by a quiet young man from Iowa who just wanted to help people like himself navigate a world that wasn't always built with them in mind. By the time Caleb was 23 years old, the app had generated $3.7 million. $3.7 million that belonged to him, that he had earned with his own mind and his own relentless focus and his own belief that he could create something that mattered. He didn't spend it recklessly. He saved most of it. He reinvested in the app, making it better, making it more accessible. He thought about his responsibilities and his future in a way that some people twice his age never do. And that's when Elaine came back. She called on a Wednesday evening, and Dad picked up the phone without knowing what he was about to hear. Her voice had changed, he said later, but it was still unmistakably her. She said she had heard about Caleb's success on the news. She said she was so proud of him. She said she wanted to talk to her son, that she missed her children, that it was time to make amends. She said she had been wrong to leave, and she wanted to explain, and she wanted to be a part of his life again, and she wanted to celebrate what he had accomplished. She said she had been thinking about us for years, that she had never stopped loving us, that she had just been lost and confused and dealing with her own demons. And my father, because he is a man who believes in second chances even when second chances are not earned, he said yes. He said she could call Caleb. He said maybe they could meet for coffee. He said maybe it was time for healing. He didn't know yet that healing requires honest reflection, and Elaine was not the kind of woman who had ever honestly reflected on anything in her life. What happened next unfolded with the kind of terrible inevitability that makes you realize you should have seen it coming from a mile away, even though there's no way you could have possibly seen it coming at all. Elaine didn't just want a relationship with Caleb. She wanted access to his accounts. She wanted to be involved in business decisions. She wanted a stake in the company. She started saying things to him that made it clear she had done some research, some homework, some planning. She said things like, "A mother should be recognized for her son's success, and without my DNA, none of this would have been possible." And worst of all, she started trying to convince Caleb that his father had been using him, had been manipulating him, had been trying to profit off his talents. She said things like, "Your father has been playing the victim this whole time, acting like he's so noble for staying, but really, he's just been grooming you to feel obligated to him." She said, "You don't owe him your loyalty just because he did the basic minimum of parenting." She said, I'm your real family, and I understand what it's like to want more from life, to want recognition, to want things. She poisoned a relationship that had been built on years of genuine love and consistent presence, and she did it while smiling and claiming that she was trying to help. She did it over phone calls that lasted hours, conversations that twisted Caleb's understanding of his own father and his own past. She did it gradually, so gradually that Caleb didn't even realize it was happening until he found himself pulling away from Dad, until he found himself questioning every moment of care and attention, wondering if it had all been manipulation. And when Caleb, who is brilliant but also sometimes trusting because he struggles with reading people's intentions, when he believed her and started pulling away from Dad, it broke something in our family. It broke it in a way that made my father realize he had to fight. Not with words, not with love, not with the kind of patience he had shown all those years. He had to fight with lawyers and courts and documents, and the kind of legal machinery that exists to protect children from people who would exploit them. My father consulted with Margaret, the lawyer, after Caleb told him he wanted to give his mother control of his financial accounts. Margaret looked at the evidence, looked at the circumstances, looked at the timeline, and she said, "This is not about a mother reconnecting with her son. This is about financial exploitation." She began building a case. She gathered the text messages where Elaine discussed Caleb's money with her friends before she ever contacted him. She found the emails where Elaine talked about cashing in on his success. She interviewed people who knew Elaine during those 11 years, people who confirmed that she had never asked about her children, never showed any interest in them, never seemed to care. Margaret was methodical. She was relentless. She was the kind of lawyer who believed in what she was doing, who believed that Caleb deserved protection, who believed that predatory behavior needed to be called out, even when it came from someone who was biologically his mother. So, we went to court. We went to court on a Tuesday in March, when the light was the wrong color, and my father sat across from his ex-wife, and Margaret, the gray-haired lawyer, prepared to show that Elaine's sudden interest in her son was not about love, it was about money. The prosecution presented evidence. It showed text messages where Elaine discussed Caleb's money with her friends before she ever contacted him. Messages that said things like, "He's loaded now. I could get a cut of that. I deserve something for giving him life." It showed financial records demonstrating that she had been in debt, struggling, desperate. It showed that she had filed for bankruptcy twice in the years since she left us. It showed email communications where she talked about cashing in on his success, where she strategized with another woman about how to get her name added to his accounts. It showed a pattern of calculated behavior disguised as maternal concern. The defense, Elaine's lawyer, tried to paint my father as a man who was isolating Caleb from his mother, trying to turn him against her, keeping them apart out of spite or jealousy. But the evidence was overwhelming. The timeline was undeniable. The sudden appearance of a mother right after her son became wealthy, after 11 years of silence, it all added up to something that looked a lot less like love and a lot more like hunger. And then, in a moment that I will never forget, Caleb himself took the stand. My brother, who hates being the center of attention, who prefers the company of his code and his apps and his orderly, predictable digital worlds, he stood in front of that courtroom and he spoke. His hands shook. His voice was quiet, but he spoke the truth. He said, "My father has been here for every single day of my life that has mattered. When I was struggling in school because teachers didn't understand how my brain works, he sat with me for hours and helped me understand myself. When I created my first program and it was terrible, he didn't laugh. He helped me debug it and encouraged me to try again. When Connect Flow started to succeed, he told me he was proud of me, but he also told me that the money was mine, that I should handle it responsibly, that I had a gift and I needed to use it in a way that felt true to who I am." He paused, and his hands shook a little more, and he said, "My mother called me 3 weeks ago. Before that, I hadn't heard from her since I was 13 years old. She said she loved me and wanted to know me, but what she really wanted was for me to add her name to my accounts. When I told her no, she started telling me that my father was manipulating me, that he didn't really care about me, that I was being used. But I have journals. I have emails. I have memories of every single moment my father showed up for me. I know my father. I have 11 years of evidence that he loves me. I have one phone call as evidence that she cares about money. I'm not going back to having zero contact with her, but I'm also not going to pretend that what she's doing is driven by love. It's not. And I deserve better than that. I deserve a mother who wants to know me for who I am, not for what I can give her. The courtroom was absolutely silent when he finished. I could hear someone crying in the back row. I could hear the faint sound of traffic outside the building. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. The judge looked at Elaine, and I could see something shift in his expression. He looked at my father, and there was something like recognition there, something like respect. He looked at the lawyers and the documents and the evidence, and then he made his ruling. He ruled that Caleb, as an adult, had the right to make his own financial decisions, and that Elaine had no legal claim to his assets or his accounts or his company. He ruled that her sudden reappearance in his life had been motivated by financial gain rather than genuine parental concern. He also ordered mandatory family therapy if Elaine wanted to maintain any relationship with Caleb going forward, and he made it clear that Caleb had the right to refuse that therapy if he felt unsafe or manipulated at any point. The judge looked directly at Elaine and said, "You have a son who is willing to give you another chance, but that chance comes with conditions. Those conditions are designed to protect him, not to punish you. I suggest you take this opportunity to do the real work of understanding what you did and why you did it." When the gavel came down, I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel vindicated. I thought I would feel like justice had been served and everything could go back to normal. But what I actually felt was tired. I felt tired in a way that goes deeper than sleep. I felt the weight of 11 years of abandonment. I felt the pain of having my mother try to use my brother's genius for her own gain. I felt relief, yes, but it was the relief that comes after you've been holding your breath for so long that you forgot what normal breathing felt like. My father stood up, and he put his hand on Caleb's shoulder, and he didn't say anything, because sometimes there's nothing to say. Sometimes the just standing there is enough. What happened in the days and weeks after the verdict was almost more important than the verdict itself. Caleb, because he is Caleb, he decided he wanted to give his mother another chance. Not because he believed her claims about loving him, not because he thought she was going to suddenly transform into a devoted parent, but because he wanted to know if she was capable of real change. He wanted to test whether his mother could actually do the work required to rebuild trust. He agreed to family therapy, and my father agreed to go as well, even though it couldn't have been easy for him. They met with a therapist named Dr. Sharon Williams every other Thursday for an hour in a small office that smelled like lavender and possibility, and all the things that healing is supposed to smell like. And Elaine, for the first few sessions, she tried to manipulate the therapy. She tried to suggest that Dad had turned Caleb against her. She tried to paint herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had made mistakes but was being unfairly punished for them. She tried to reframe her abandonment as a temporary breakdown rather than a choice, as something that happened to her rather than something she did. But Dr. Williams, she had heard it all before, and she was not interested in letting Elaine rewrite history. She had decades of experience working with families torn apart by betrayal and abandonment and manipulation. She knew the patterns. She knew the ways that people try to avoid accountability. She asked Elaine direct questions about why she had left. She asked her about the 11 years of silence. She asked her about the timing of her return. She asked her about the text messages and the emails and the strategic planning. She asked her about what kind of mother doesn't reach out to check on her children for over a decade. And slowly, very slowly, Elaine began to actually tell the truth. It wasn't a sudden breakthrough. It was gradual, painful, piece by piece. She said she had left because she felt suffocated by the responsibility of being a mother. She said she had wanted more from her life than what she felt she was getting. She said she had been angry at my father for being content with less, for not wanting more, for seemingly being happy with a modest life and modest dreams. She said she had felt trapped. She said she had made a terrible decision, and then she had compounded it by staying away, because coming back would have meant admitting she was wrong, and she couldn't face that at the time. She said she had been wrong to leave, and she had stayed away because she didn't know how to face what she had done. She said she had come back when she heard about the money because she was desperate, because her own life had not turned out the way she wanted it to, because she saw something that looked like a second chance, or at least like a way to fix some of the financial problems she had created for herself. It was not a perfect reconciliation. It was not the kind of tearful reunion you see in movies where everyone forgives each other and the family walks off into the sunset holding hands. It was harder than that.
It was more real than that.
It was honest, and honesty is sometimes the only foundation that healing can be built on. Caleb and Elaine did eventually establish a relationship, but it was different from what either of them might have imagined. It was careful. It was bounded by clear agreements about what Caleb was willing to give and what he was not. It was built on the reality of who they actually were to each other, rather than on fantasy or manipulation or guilt. They had coffee once a month. Caleb set that boundary, and Elaine respected it. They didn't talk about money. They didn't talk about what she had missed. They talked about books that Caleb was reading, about movies they both enjoyed, about the small moments of life. It was not ideal. It was not what either of them might have hoped for in a perfect world. But it was real, and real is sometimes better than perfect because at least you know where you stand. My father, he learned something from all of this too. He learned that protecting your children sometimes means saying no. It means setting boundaries. It means being willing to fight for them in a courtroom if you have to. But it also means understanding that they will eventually grow up and make their own choices about who gets access to their life and their heart. He could not force Caleb to cut Elaine out completely, even though part of him probably wanted to. He could only be there, consistently and faithfully, through whatever choices Caleb made. He did that. He continued showing up every week. He continued being present and steady and reliable. And Caleb, he continued to know that his father was his foundation, the person he could always count on, the person who had shown up on every single day that mattered. And me, I learned that stories like this matter. I learned that there are so many families dealing with abandonment and manipulation, and the kind of betrayal that comes from someone who is supposed to love you unconditionally. I learned that when you speak the truth about what happened in your own life, other people recognize themselves in that truth. They see their own mothers who left them. They see their own siblings who have been manipulated. They see their own fathers who sacrificed everything and asked for nothing. And they feel less alone. I started all of Revenge Stories because I needed to tell this story. I needed to tell it for my father, who has never asked for anything except to be believed when he says he tried his best. I needed to tell it for Caleb, who is building a life that is entirely his own, created by his own genius and guarded by his own boundaries. I needed to tell it for myself because writing about trauma and betrayal is how I make sense of it. But I also tell these stories for you. For everyone who has ever been left and wondered if they were the reason. For everyone who has ever been manipulated and doubted their own perception of reality. For everyone who has ever needed permission to say that what happened to them was not okay, and it was not their fault, and they were allowed to be angry about it. The court case ended in March, but the real story didn't end there. The real story is ongoing. It's in the way my father and Caleb spend Sunday afternoons together, still just the two of them, sometimes talking, sometimes working on projects together, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. It's in the code that Caleb writes, pouring his particular genius into solutions that help other people who struggle the way he struggles. It's in the financial stability that Caleb has built for himself and will eventually use to help others. It's in a relationship that Caleb has carefully constructed with our mother, guarded and honest and real. It's in my voice telling you this story, right now, and in your ears listening, because when we tell each other the truth about our lives, we remind each other that we're not alone, and we never have to pretend that everything was fine when everything was broken. So, I want to ask you something as we wrap up. What would you have done if you were in my father's shoes? Would you have fought that hard? Would you have believed that your child deserved better than someone who would use them? Would you have been willing to go to court and risk it all, knowing that it might destroy any chance of reconciliation? Would you have had the courage to stand up and say, "Not on my watch"? I want to hear from you. I want to know how this story landed for you, because I'm not here just to tell you tales. I'm here to have a conversation. I'm here to acknowledge that these stories matter, that your stories matter, that the person you've become in the aftermath of being hurt and betrayed and abandoned, that person matters. If you thought this was shocking, Wait until you hear what happened next. Because this isn't where the story ends. This is just where the real healing begins. There's more coming, stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty and betrayal, and the family members who choose to show up, and the ones who only show up when there's something to gain. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. Hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me your thoughts. Share this with someone who needs to know that they're not crazy for being angry about their own abandonment. And thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for listening to my family story. Thank you for caring enough to sit with us in that courthouse on a Tuesday in March. Thank you for believing that what happens to us matters, and that telling the truth about it is one of the most powerful things we can do. We'll be back soon with another story that needs to be heard. Until then, keep breathing, keep fighting, and remember, you deserve people in your life who choose you every single day, not just when there's something in it for them. You deserve honesty. You deserve consistency. You deserve a love that shows up on the hard days, not just the ones where success is on the table.
You deserve that.
We all do.